Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 159, and today's episode is focused on Restless Breed, the fourth studio album from New York-based rock/metal band Riot, or no, these days known as Riot V. So, this, of course, was originally released through Elektra Records on May 21st of 1982, and the day that I'm recording this, which is a Saturday, and it is the 21st of May, this album has already reached its 40th anniversary, so it's, I think, was a great idea to finally kind of get around to really showcase this album onto my channel, because again, I've already done plenty, Riot albums on this channel. Again, I've already did Narita. I did Fire Down Under. Now, continuing on with Restless Breed. So, Restless Breed. This album, of course, again, it follows 1981's Fire Down Under. And I guess after months of at least the band, performing, let's say, the Heavy Metal Holocaust Festival in the Netherlands, which featured bands like Vardis, Motorhead, Ozzy, even though it was planned to be Black Sabbath, but something, I guess, was it Black Sabbath that did eventually got to play there? I don't know. One of the reunions, but I can't quite recall the real situation of what happened and why and what things got changed. But still, Black Sabbath, of course, at that time was still with Ronnie James Dio, but there was a lot of turmoil between the members of Ronnie James Dio and the other members of Black Sabbath, so I don't know quite sure if they really got to perform there, but of course Ozzy did play that festival anyways. So then, of course, what Triumph was on that was on there, but Riot ended up playing on that bill, and from there it seemed like it was very steady. And they were doing, I guess, pretty well, with the contract of Elektra Records, but I don't know what happened there between Guy Speranza and the rest of the band. I guess there was some issues, drug issues, and I don't know if he was kicked out of the band or he had just left. But eventually he pretty much leaves the band or just out of the band, and then they found the replacement in, of course, Rhett Forrester. So, and I'm just going to look up where Rhett Forrester was originally based out. I think he was Tucker, Georgia, he was based out of. So, he ends up becoming the replacement, and I don't know if they did some shows during that list to kind of get him, have his performance or something, and Riot, I guess, sink in with the audiences. Because, again, Riot was pretty much with Guy Speranza, they were a pretty good, considered an attraction as a live band. There were definitely people that really were into them. They got again, after playing the very first Monsters of Rock festival in August of 1980, and being on a bill with some of the biggest, or at least at that time, one of the biggest bands within hard rock and heavy metal, it seemed like it was a really good reaction towards the band. They got a really good following. So I guess when it comes to getting newer vocalists into at least a band, it's usually going to be a little bit of a step-by-step kind of situation. Are they, are you really sure the people are going to really be into if you release your very first record before you really get on a stage in front of a crowd to kind of, let's say, get a reaction out of you or something? You don't really know what is going to be the situation. So I don't know if they did some shows with him first before going into the studio. Either way, eventually they do head into the studio, which was the Green Saint Recordings in New York City, and it had to be sometime within early of 1982. And, of course, with producers Steve Loeb and Billy Arnell, who had been, of course, the production team for Riot since the very first album, Rock City, in 1977. So, same production team. And so here we are, of course, in 1982, at least sometime before May, and then eventually, after laying down, possibly, I guess it was 10 songs, because there's not really a lot of other information about other various different songs. If there were, they probably would have been put on that High Roller compilation disc that had a lot of, like, especially for the Rhett Forrester era compilation album that featured like a lot of demos and some unreleased stuff, and most of the unreleased stuff was one song from the Born America album, which would be the album that follows Restless Breed, and that would be, of course, I'll elaborate on a bit of that at the end of this video, at least close to the end when I'm like, talking to here about Restless Breed and giving my thoughts and everything. So, still, I guess there's just 10 songs that just got laid down, and pretty much these 10 songs gets pressed on a record, gets released through Elektra on May 21st of 1982, and so everyone really around the world ends up getting a taste of Rhett Forrester, the brand new vocalist for Riot out of New York. So, without further ado, let me just get into the actual album itself. Let's get into Restless Breed. So, for Restless Breed, again, there are 10 songs for this album, and it actually clocks in at the length of 38 minutes and 38 seconds. That's at least is the length that Wikipedia is saying as, even though Metal Archive is saying it's 40 minutes and 33 seconds. I think that there's a timing issue with one of the songs. So I'm actually going to believe more, and I believe it's more accurate as far as the length, because I didn't get to really rip the CD into my computer yet. So I really can't tell you the real definitive, but I know it's definitely not 40 minutes. It's definitely 38 minutes at least for the album. And that's usually with the song Over to You, and the issue with, I guess, someone accidentally putting in the wrong time length for the song on Metal Archives, which is not it ain't a revelation. There's a lot of idiots on the Metal Archives that don't know or don't pay attention to what they're doing over there. So, yes, I always have to, in many ways, when it comes to these videos, take as many shots at them as possible, because they are very much unreliable in most cases. So I'm always going to do my annual Metal Archives "You Suck" kind of rants. So there you go. I know I can't come up with anything better to kind of refer to my overall ranting on the Metal Archives. Alright, I digress. So, these 10 songs are beginning with Hard Loving Man, CIA, the title track, a cover of The Animals, or Eric Burdon and the Animals, When I Was Young, Lone Shark, Loved by You, Over to You, Showdown, Dream Away, and finally ending with Violent Crimes. So there's your 10 songs for the album here. Now, being familiar with the way they were earlier with, let's say, the Guy Speranza era albums, being Rock City, Narita, and Fire Down Under, I don't know if you can necessarily call them heavy, especially by today's standards. They weren't really heavy, but I think at that period in time, they definitely were a little bit on the heavy side for them. I mean, the first album being released in 1977 during the really early primitive stages of what would become, or what many people would consider, heavy metal in the 80s. Even though many will say that it was still relatively hard rock in 1977, it still had a very primitive edge to it, but it still felt very feral compared to some other bands in 1977, let alone, with the exception, let's say, AC/DC and Motorhead, and maybe Ted Nugent to an extent, who were kind of coming up with more raunchier, a little more louder bass kind of stuff that really kind of pushed the boundaries of being what really was considered heavy, besides, of course, Judas Priest as well, who really kind of took things even more further. But still, just bands that were just absolutely feral sounding. Riot were kind of pushing that a little bit, and they definitely showed that they definitely had a very intensity to their sound. And that, of course, kind of really, in many ways, was a little bit expanded on Narita, where that one really kind of upped up a little bit the production, and it also really upped up some of the songs, because that one really kind of brought a much more of a slightly heavier edge to them. But it still, I guess to some, wasn't quite metal, but it still was very heavy for 1979. Again, other albums, you know, from Motorhead, AC/DC, and so on, it kind of fit in a little bit. And of course, the whole the burgeoning new wave or British heavy metal movement, which Riot kind of really fit in alongside, and that's what kind of gained them a lot of attention because of that era in 1980 with the Monsters of Rock festival. So they really were kind of getting, they definitely were showing who they were. And so when it came to an album like Fire Down Under, it seemed like to be the album that really kind of broke them a little bit in the underground. It kind of made them, that put more eyes on them. And that's because of songs like, for example, like the title track. And of course, maybe Run For Your Life. And of course, Swords and Tequila. That's pretty much what really kind of helped really gain them even more, it just gained them a lot more speed in terms of the way they were. So when it came to an album like Restless Breed, which is the first album here that would introduce everyone to Rhett Forrester, it definitely starts out very hard. I mean, it's got two real heavy kind of songs. I mean, Hard Loving Man's kind of more on the hard rock kind of terrain, but it's still a very heavy song, and it's got a real mean riff to it. Almost, again, kind of like a slight AC/DC kind of feel going on there. But still, it fits. It works. Then you get into CIA, and it sounds more, again, more like classic Riot. Anything that would have fit alongside, you know, like Fire Down Under or even Narita. You know, it's got that same intensity going on. But this is where things begin to kind of, you could start to hear a little bit of a difference with this album. And that's with, of course, like Restless Breed, again, the title track here. And this one is definitely more mellower, a little more melodic, but it still has a bit of a bluesy feel to it. It still very rocks when it hits into the song. But it's definitely one of the more slower songs, but still it's got a real nice catchy hook to it, and I really do dig it. Again, you can kind of say that it kind of borrows a little bit at times from the Southern rock kind of bands, mostly, for example, being Molly Hadgen and Blackfoot. But it still has that very New York-based, very almost bluesy, heavy kind of hard rock feel to it. But I think the real thing where you start to get the more the feel of this album and why it feels different compared to the previous three albums is, of course, with their cover of When I Was Young, which is actually a really good cover. Actually, it's one of the few cover songs I think they did a really good job with. Maybe besides Born to Be Wild, but that's a different reason. I know some may scoff at that now, because how many times that song had been covered by so many bands. But still, I think they did a good job with Born to Be Wild on Narita. But with When I Was Young, I think this one kind of, showcased more, I guess, personal. It feels very different at times. They really did a really good job with it. And normally that's not a song that I don't think has ever been covered a lot of times up until this point. Probably, but it was probably more slightly, maybe not very big bands. But Riot, I think, are more notable for this. But I think it's a fine cover, and it works in the album's advantage, and it gives, I think, the album its own identity. And of course, we get back to, like Lone Shark, which is back to be more heavier, more classic Riot. Then, of course, that's at least is the first half of the album. Again, Hard Loving Man, CAA, the title track, and Lone Shark are pretty much more like classics Riot, even though it might experiment a little bit of that. And then again, Fire Down Under did the same thing in many ways, but somehow I guess people really enjoyed the experimentation of Fire Down Under compared to what they would do on this album, and which would really become more apparent. And the second half of this album, that being, of course, with Love By You, which kind of starts out a little bit like classic Riot, but this song kind of experiments. And this one is more like your almost very bar-based jam type of blues rock kind of song. And it still rocks, but the thing that kind of gives this song and really gives the listener that they really are experimenting is the fact that they're playing with the harmonica, mostly harmonica slash guitar, which for some reason, instead of giving me Aerosmith vibes, it gave me more like Jake Giles kind of vibes a little bit, in a way. But that's my personal thing. You're never gonna hear me, I guess, name drop the Jake Giles bands in any of my videos. But me, who's grown up with at least a father who was a big Jake Giles band fan, and after spending years listening to some of their music, for some reason, Love by You just somehow gives me that kind of a feel a bit. It kind of gives me that just that vibe in a way. It just comes off like that. And some may think this is a bad idea and it might be one of the worst songs on the album, but personally, I kind of enjoy it, probably because there's a bit of a sincerity to it. It comes across like a band that's actually having fun playing this song, instead of just being like, oh, we need to have something that might appeal to at least the radio stations, It's not really too commercial, because when you listen to a lot of other commercial songs, this song would pass as, let's say, 1970s based commercialism than 1980s or early 80s commercialism, in my opinion. It just comes across as that. Very boogie in a way, but I think, again, for me, who likes that kind of style, it just, to me, works good for me. Over to You, kind of is a more mellower kind of song, a little more melodic, but it's a fine, well-written track, and I think it's not too bad. Showdown is probably the one that comes closest being more of a ballad on the album. It's probably the only time where I think the band really gets very ballady in their time, because for the most part, they were just a straight-up, just guitar-driven rock and roll kind of band. They were very heavy, they were very metallic at times, but they were just more guitar-driven. And this one is, but it's just more mellower and more kind of very, just, I guess, just more ballad based. It just comes across, well, I guess like a power ballad, but more in a bluesier kind of way. But it's not a bad song at all. I do kind of dig it. Again, it's got sincerity to it. Dream Away, this one again, very melodic, and that's the one thing you get about the second half of the album. It's very different from the first half of the album, especially, the majority of the second half here is definitely more different compared to the first half. So it's probably the reason why when it came, like records at this period, everyone was probably playing the first half more than they were probably playing the second half. So that's why when it comes to people who are listening to this on CD, it just seems very different and very almost uncharacteristic at times. But again, that's probably the reason why I think there's a little bit of an interesting factor to a band like Riot. The fact that Mark Reale and co. can just really kind of come up with at least something that would just be more varied and be more different from the previous other albums, than just trying to just be like, let's just hammer it down and be, just play almost, I guess, the same thing. But even though I have no problem with that, I like bands that can do that. But sometimes it's a little bit more interesting too when you really get into a band that will kind of test the bit of the listeners' palates, kind of push it around a little bit and see if how they react, and there's something that I admire. Again, it's songwriting. So the fact that the majority of the second half is a little more melodic and really kind of plays around with the genre styles a little bit is, I think, an admirable idea. I think it's very admirable. So there we go. Then it finally ends with Violent Crimes, which we are back to the way the first half was basically, and that's where it sounds like classic Riot. It's more of a heavier song. It's a shorter song of 2 minutes and 30 seconds. It's the shortest song on the entire album, but it is just a more of a burgeoning, very almost speed metal based heavy track, and it sounds like classic Riot. It's very much in the same vein as like Lone Shark, or even, let's say, classic songs like Run for Your Life and the title track, Fire Down Under. So it's just like more classic, early 80s sounding Riot, where it's just more metal in a way, and it just rocks from start to finish. So there it is. That's pretty much just my overall thoughts and the way I'm at when it comes to Restless Breed, because as a whole, it's definitely a more experimental album from these guys. And for an album that is definitely introducing everybody to, of course, Rhett Forrester, normally it would be the better idea is to introduce them with an album that would be more, that sounds like the previous album, in a way where it's still very heavy, very rockin'. But that's normally what you do, because again, AC/DC gave everyone Back in Black, and that was everyone's first introduction to at least Brian Johnson on a much more wider scale than those who probably knew that he was in a band called Geordie. Same thing again, Iron Maiden with Bruce Dickinson and so on, or them, maybe Paul Di'Anno, especially for those who were in again the early pub days of Britain in the UK during the new wave of British heavy metal movement, especially its infancy in the late 70s, that probably also knew of Iron Maiden with its original singers like Paul O'Day, for example. So they just, I think it's normally when you make a record that's going to have at least a brand new singer that's going to, be the way that's going to introduce the listener to this person, you think that the idea is that it's going to be more like the previous sound. It's going to be more rockin', and it's going to give you a much more better idea of what he is. And for the most part, it does that with Restless Breed. But when you get to the second half of this album is where you all of a sudden get like, whoa, okay, this is not what I was expecting in a way, because it's a very experimental album where it plays around with at least maybe some of Mark Reality's early influences, maybe at times Rhett Forrester's influences, it kind of plays around with that. It ends up sounding more 1975, 1978 than it does at least 1982, because at this point everyone is getting, Screaming for Vengeance, they're getting Number the Beast. They're getting Restless and Wild over in Germany, and they're even getting, let's say, the Merciful Fate EP. Some people are getting these kind of records in 1982. I mean, this is May, so some albums aren't yet coming out, but still, you're getting some heavy hitters. I mean, Iron Fist from Motorhead. You're getting these kind of albums, but then you get Restless Breed, which is the album that's introducing everyone to this guy, and it starts out like, okay, this is going to be great, and you get on, it's like, okay, this is not what I'm starting to expect. And that's really going to be the impression that people get by the second half of the album when they flip the record over, and it's like, well, okay, this is not what I'm expecting. But is that a bad thing? Some say it was a bad thing. I personally think it was a very fascinating thing, because again, I kind of enjoy the second half as well. I mean, it's definitely not nearly as rockin' and as heavy as the first half, but it still is a pretty fascinating listen. And again, for me, who digs more, less heavy kind of stuff, more of, the 70s and everything, I actually dig the second half of this album. So I have no problem with some of the album in a way. I think it's a very fine record. Of course, I've now seen a lot of other opinions about the album. I've seen many people say that this album was the only good album with Rhett Forrester on vocals. I disagree with that, because of obviously the first Riot album I would listen to from start to finish would be the album that would come after Restless Breed. That would be the final album with Rhett Forrester and Riot. So that would be that one. That would be Born America. So I just have my own opinions, but I have grown to really appreciate Restless Breed and what it tried to do, and I think it succeeded in some ways, probably it didn't, but those are some of the fascinating things about Riot of Restless Breed that just strikes out at me. So that's where I'm at. So there it is. Okay, so after, of course, releasing Restless Breed in I've got it right up here. In July 5th of 1982, at the new Peppermint Lounge in New York City. They recorded, of course, at least I guess hammering down probably was a full live set, but they chose at least 6 songs from this set list and had it mastered at Masterdisc in Peekskill, New York, and had it released sometime later in 1982 through, of course, Elektra Records as a live EP. And this live EP, of course, was again marked around 30 minutes and 22 seconds. And at least it featured mostly songs from, of course, Restless Breed. That, of course, being Hard Loving Man, Showdown, Loved by You, Lone Shark, and, of course, the title track. All were released as live versions on this EP with at least a classic in Swords and Tequila, which is the first time anyone would ever hear at least Rhett Forrester singing Swords and Tequila on record. Some would say that was a bad thing. I think it was a very interesting thing and kind of cool in ways. Because again, I actually do dig Rhett Forrester's vocals. He's he's more different at times from a guy like Guy Speranza. He's got a little more of a grit to him. He's a little more, almost more bluesier in his delivery, and I think it really kind of works. Again, I wouldn't say he's like Brian Johnson, but he just has a very kind of similar kind of trait where it's just, again, probably the best comparison I can have for Rhett Forrester would be Mark Tonillo, again, of TT Quick, and now these days, Accept. So that's, he always just kind of reminds me a little bit. Again, of course, Mark Tonillo and Rhett Forrester. So that's just kind of the best. They just sound alike at times. They got a little of a similar feel. So there I am. Again, it was a pretty fun EP, and of course these days has been released as bonus tracks for some of the remasters and reissues of Restless Breed. So there it is. So that's it. That's it, folks. There's my overall thoughts on Restless Breed, the 4th studio album from Riot. I know nowadays Riot V, but I don't want to get into all of that kind of crap. Either way, it's, of course, it's reached its 40th anniversary. If you were there when this album was released, and if you have, let's say, any sort of memories or what were your original thoughts when it came out, you can leave those comments in the comment section below, whether it be positive or negative. But if you at least end up getting into this album later on, much later on, and probably didn't really get into it first, but probably got into it a lot more better, like, meaning it clicked with you finally. Again, you can leave those comments in the comment section below, or if you've never really heard it in general, is it a good starting point for you if you're really trying to, let's say, check out Riot? Is it a good starting point? I wouldn't think it's a good starting point. Again, if you're going to start out, it's probably going to be any of the first 3 albums in general if you want to get out the early period of Riot. Of course, there's always the stuff that came right after, Born America. That being, of course, well, the ones with Tony Moore on vocals, that being Thundersteel, more kind of real speed metal / US power metal kind of sound, or even the more Richie Blackmore, almost rainbowish kind of sound of, the 90s period and the 2000s and so on, those albums. So there we go. That's pretty much where I'm going to end this right here. Again, it's a solid album from beginning to end. So there it is. Again, and as far as obtaining it, it shouldn't be that difficult. There's so many copies of this album that has been released, and they're still relatively cheap to get. So that's where I'm at. It shouldn't be that difficult. So there it is. I hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.